The wars of the colonizers in America with the local Indian tribes were both brutal and bloody, and, understandably, there were prisoners on both sides in the course of the skirmishes. The attitude of the native Indians themselves toward the prisoners, whether they belonged to the rival tribes or to others, was practically the same. Welcome to Flip Side of History, the other side of the known history. Today we are gonna tell you about native Indians' attitude toward captured women and how did they treat them. Let's begin. The Indians took children's lives at once during the raids. If they survived and were taken as prisoners of war, they could raise them as a full member of their tribe. As for the men, well, the situations ranged from a painful death immediately after the battle to being taken prisoner. For example, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 companions who were captured in what is now Texas are considered the earliest official Indian captives. The men, possessing medical knowledge, quickly enough gained authority in captivity and lived relatively well, having both freedom of movement and respect of those who once captured them, even some form of honor. As for women, the fate of captive women could be both the most pitiful, which, to be fair, was a rare occurrence, and also the most dignified. The most surprising thing to many is that it was the captive women who were generally treated with the respect they deserved. The young girls who had not reached maturity at the time of captivity and theoretically could become full-fledged members of their new tribe were especially valued among Indians. There are numerous cases in history when girls who were taken captive later advanced to high enough positions in the given tribe. For example, Cynthia Ann Parker, captured as a child, became a full member of her tribe, later marrying Comanche chief Pettanacona. Cynthia Ann Parker was the mother of the last so-called military tribal chief, Juana Parker. Speaking of which, when Cynthia was discovered in 1860 and returned to her family, she tried several times to escape back to her tribe. The case of Millie Durgan, a kidnapped girl who grew up in captivity, married a Kiowa tribe warrior and lived happily into old age, is also well known. However, besides little girls, women of rather mature adolescence were also taken prisoner. Such captives, on the other hand, hated their new masters and did everything in their power to get out of the captivity, to take revenge on their captors. And they often did so at the risk of their own lives. For example, 13-year-old Matilda Lockhart, who had been captured, dreamed of avenging the Comanches for their humiliation and cruel treatment of her. In 1840, while meeting with Indians at the San Antonio Council House, the girl provoked a violent brawl. She declared that the Comanches were in fact hiding more than 1 or 2 dozen captives, languishing in their captivity. For the most part, however, the native Indians did not tolerate violence against captive girls and women, because the moral code of the Indians simply did not permit such actions against members of the weaker gender. And generally it was widespread among various tribes across America. If a captive did not want to stay in the tribe or marry one of the warriors, or even the chief, then the captive's fate awaited a ransom. And women became quite a good business for the Indians. Women were captured for the purpose of later selling them to relatives. There were even special agents who searched for captives, ransomed them from the Indians, and then resold them to grieving family members. In addition, the Indians were never forced into the tribe. If a captive wanted to become a member of a certain tribe, she could. If not, she simply waited until she was ransomed. Young girls were often adopted by the chief's family. Women were considered among the Indians exhausted, but strong enough physically, naturally, beautiful and able to give birth to worthy offspring. Therefore, the practice of adoption by chief's family was later transformed into a ritual rewarding the most successful warrior, who received the right to marry the beautiful daughter of the leader of the tribe. And, as mentioned in Cynthia's example, many captives who chose to remain in the tribe tried to return even after their release. Strange as it may be, life in a seemingly primitive society was much more suitable and comfortable for women than life in a civilized at that time society. The aforementioned Cynthia, having failed to return to her native tribe, wished at least to have her remains buried on the reservation. And finally, the entire length of the journey of the captive of Indian tribe is most vividly illustrated by the fate of the 2 sisters who were held captive during the so-called Oatman Massacre. This tragedy was named after the family, the Oatmans, who were trying to make their way to California. While traveling, the parents and their 7 children, about 90 miles from Yuma, were attacked. presumably by warriors of the Yavapai tribe. The family was first approached by white Americans, asking for tobacco or food, and then they themselves began to slaughter. All were killed except the two sisters, Olive and Mary Ann, and their older brother, Lorenz, who was left to die after being wounded. Fortunately, the young man survived and was later able to talk about what had happened. The bodies of the dead were buried by nearby Mormons, whom Lorenz managed to reach, but the girls disappeared without a trace. Later, they said that once in the tribe, they became virtual slaves. The girls were forced to gather branches for fire, collect food, and were constantly humiliated and mocked by the native Indian children, who even burned the girls' hands with burning sticks. The adults, meanwhile, also behaved quite inappropriately, often physically punishing the girls, so much so that the older Olive was firmly convinced that sooner or later she and her sister would be killed. The sisters had been living in these conditions for about a year when the Mojave Indians came to the tribe. These visits were usually for exchanges, purchases, and sales of goods and food needed by the tribes. The captives were immediately noticed by the Mojave and ransomed, so soon Olive and Mary found themselves in another tribe. And here the attitude toward them changed completely. Both sisters were adopted by the chief, and the chief's wife, Aspeno, and his daughter, Topeka, treated the girls very kindly and took care of them. Olive later described how they were treated better by the Mojave than their own daughters. The girls were no longer forced to work, and as a sign of their acceptance as full members, Olive and Mary were tattooed on their faces. She stressed that Espensé and Aspeno raised them as their own daughters. The unique thing in this situation is while settlers often stayed with the Mojave tribe, but the girls never asked them for help. It was not until one day when the Mojave tribe suffered a famine brought on by a drought, when Olive's younger sister died of starvation, that one of the visitors noticed a white girl in the tribe. And soon a messenger from the Fort Yuma arrived in the tribe, who conveyed the military for its demand that the girl be brought back immediately. The tribesmen initially tried to hide the fact that Olive was staying with them, but the military promised to simply destroy the entire village. Olive, left without her sister, made the decision to return back to civilization. The young woman herself, who was 19 at the time, later recalled the negotiations over her fate. I revealed that they said I was not American, but belonged to a race of people who looked like Indians, who seemed to live far away from the setting sun. They colored my face and feet and hands, the likes of which no other people I had ever known. They told me not to speak to Francisco in English, instead to speak to him in another language, to tell him that I was not American. But I spoke to him in broken English and told him the whole truth, including what they were forcing me to say. He rose from his seat in anger and exclaimed that he would not tolerate it. After this, the Indians of the tribe were ready to kill the girl right on the spot, allegedly for the betrayal, but the tribal leader and his wife forbade any harm to Olive. Soon the girl returned to her own people, seeing her brother. However, her best friend later recounted that Olive missed her native Indian husband and two sons for the rest of her life, and spoke quite clearly of attitude towards her. It must be said to my credit that they never treated me with insult. And finally, even after the girl returned to normal life, married, and seemingly put the past behind her, many neighbors noticed that for the rest of her life, Olive never actually smiled. Perhaps it was her longing for that very life that kept her from smiling. Thank you for watching our video. Do not hesitate to leave a like and also subscribe to Flip Side of History. Also check out our other videos.